The elderly man stepped onto the stage that night, and nobody knew he was about to break Simon Cowell. When he opened his mouth, the microphone dropped. Simon stood up. The audience went silent. Because what came next wasn't just a performance. It was a promise kept to a woman who would never hear it. The lights in the Dolby Theater were blinding. The audience, thousands strong, buzzed with anticipation. Another Tuesday night. Another lineup of hopeful performers ready to change their lives on America's Got Talent. Simon Cowell sat at the judges' table, arms crossed, his signature look of controlled skepticism firmly in place. He'd seen it all. The tears, the backstories, the emotional pleas. After decades in this industry, very little surprised him anymore. But when the stage manager announced the next act, something shifted in the energy of the room. The curtains parted slowly, and a man walked out. Not a young performer chasing stardom. Not a group with flashy costumes. Just one man. Alone. In his early 70s, wearing a simple button-down shirt and gray slacks. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped a worn photograph and approached the microphone stand at center stage. Simon glanced at the other judges. Howie looked curious. Heidi leaned forward. Sophia's expression softened immediately. There was something about this man that didn't fit the usual pattern. No showmanship. No bravado. Just quiet, almost unbearable vulnerability. The man cleared his throat. "My name is Robert," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "I'm 72 years old. And I'm here because I made a promise to my wife." But what he said next made Simon Cowell do something he'd never done before in his entire career. He stopped the show. Robert stood under the stage lights, blinking against the brightness. His fingers tightened around the photograph in his hand. It was creased and faded, the kind of image that had been held too many times, carried in a wallet for years, touched in moments of loneliness. Simon's voice cut through the silence. "Robert," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Tell us about your wife." Robert's lips trembled. He looked down at the photograph. "Her name was Eleanor," he began. "We were married for 51 years. She passed away 8 months ago." His voice cracked on the last word, and the audience collectively held its breath. Howie Mandel, usually quick with a comment, said nothing. Sofia Vergara's hand moved to her chest. Heidi Klum's eyes glistened. But Simon didn't look away. He stared at Robert with an intensity that wasn't judgment. It was focus. Complete, unwavering attention. Eleanor loved to sing. Robert continued. She had the most beautiful voice. But she was shy. She never sang in public. Only for me. In our kitchen. In the car. Before bed. He paused, struggling to keep his composure. 3 years ago, she was diagnosed with cancer. And when she knew she didn't have much time left, she made me promise her something. The theater was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. She made me promise that I would sing the song she loved most. Not alone in our house. Not in front of her picture. But here. On a stage. In front of people. She said if I could do that, if I could be brave enough to sing when she couldn't anymore, then a part of her would still be alive. Simon didn't move. His jaw tightened. His fingers, usually tapping impatiently on the desk, were completely still. Robert lifted the photograph toward the audience. "This is her," he said, his voice breaking. "This is my Eleanor." The camera zoomed in on the image. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, frozen in a moment of happiness that would never return. And then Robert did something no one expected. He looked directly at Simon and said, "I know you've heard a lot of stories. I know you've seen a lot of pain. But I need you to understand. This isn't about winning. This isn't about fame. This is about keeping my word to the woman who was my entire world." Simon Cowell stood up. Not to press his buzzer. Not to walk off in frustration. He stood because something inside him had shifted. And everyone in that theater knew it. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you a side of Simon Cowell the world has never seen before. The producers in the control room exchanged panicked glances. Simon never broke protocol. Never interrupted the flow. But there he was, standing at the judges' table, his hand raised slightly as if to say, "Wait. Stop. Let me speak." Terry Crews, the host, stood frozen at the side of the stage. The camera operators didn't know where to point. The audience didn't dare breathe. Simon walked around the judges' table slowly, his eyes never leaving Robert. The elderly man looked confused, almost frightened. Had he said something wrong? Was he about to be asked to leave? But Simon didn't walk toward the exit. He walked toward the stage. Howie whispered, "What is he doing?" Sophia's hand covered her mouth. Heidi stood up too, instinctively, as if something sacred was happening and she needed to bear witness. Simon reached the edge of the stage and stopped. He looked up at Robert, who stood there clutching his photograph and microphone, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Robert," Simon said, his voice carrying through the theater without a microphone. "I've been doing this for a long time. And I've heard every story you can imagine. But what you just said..." He paused, his own voice catching. "That's not just a promise. That's love in its purest form." The audience erupted. Not in applause. In a collective release of emotion. People stood. Hands went to hearts. Tears flowed freely. Because in that moment, Simon Cowell, the man known for his sharp tongue and brutal honesty, had shown something deeper. Humanity. Recognition. Respect. Simon climbed the steps to the stage. Security moved forward instinctively, but he waved them off. He walked across the wooden floor, his dress shoes echoing in the silence, until he stood directly in front of Robert. "I want to hear you sing," Simon said quietly, though the microphones caught every word. "Not because I'm a judge, but because Eleanor deserves to hear this. And I think somehow she will." Robert's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the photograph. Simon gently took it from him, looked at Eleanor's face for a long moment, and then handed it back with a reverence that silenced any remaining whispers in the crowd. "Sing for her," Simon said. "We'll all listen." Robert nodded, unable to speak. He turned to the microphone. The band, confused but moved, waited for his cue. He closed his eyes, held the photograph to his chest, and began. And the song he sang wasn't just beautiful. It was a man's soul laid bare in front of millions. And Simon Cowell, for the first time in his career, couldn't hold it together. The song was Unchained Melody. The same version Eleanor had sung to him in their kitchen 40 years ago. The same melody she'd hummed when the pain got too bad in those final weeks. The same tune Robert had played at her funeral, unable to sing it himself. But now he sang. His voice was not trained. It cracked in places. He missed a note here and there. But it didn't matter. Because every word carried the weight of 51 years. Every lyric was soaked in memory. Every breath was a prayer. Simon stood at the side of the stage, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched, fighting something he rarely allowed himself to feel in public. His eyes were red. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, over and over, trying to maintain composure. Heidi was openly weeping. Sophia had her face in her hands. Howie sat completely still, staring at Robert with an expression of stunned reverence. The audience wasn't just watching a performance. They were witnessing a sacred act. The fulfillment of a vow made in the final hours of a woman's life. A man honoring the love of his life in the only way he knew how. As Robert reached the final verse, his voice broke completely. He could barely get the words out. But he didn't stop. He pushed through, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with the effort of holding himself together. And then it was over. The last note hung in the air. The band stopped. The lights dimmed slightly. And for 5 full seconds there was absolute silence. Then the theater exploded. People leapt to their feet. The applause was deafening. Strangers hugged each other. Grown men wiped their eyes without shame. The cameraman filming the audience captured raw, unfiltered emotion on every face. But Simon didn't move. He stood there on the stage, staring at Robert, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. And then he did something no one had ever seen him do. He walked over to Robert, who stood frozen at the microphone, overwhelmed and disoriented by the reaction. Simon placed both hands on the elderly man's shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes. "You kept your promise," Simon said, his voice thick. "Eleanor heard you. I promise you she heard you." Robert collapsed into Simon's arms. Not dramatically. Not for the cameras. Just the natural surrender of a man who had been holding his grief for 8 months and finally had permission to let it go. Simon held him. The famously stoic judge, the man who had built a career on being untouchable, held this broken, beautiful man and let him cry. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't applaud. They just watched, silent witnesses to a moment of pure, unscripted grace. But Simon wasn't done. Because what he did next would become one of the most talked about moments in the history of America's Got Talent. Simon gently released Robert and turned to face the judge's table. He walked back slowly, his expression unreadable. Howie, Sophia, and Heidi watched him, unsure of what was coming. Simon sat down. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at Robert, still standing on stage, clutching Eleanor's photograph like a lifeline. And then Simon reached forward and pressed the golden buzzer. The sound was instantaneous. Confetti cannons exploded. Golden streamers filled the air. The audience screamed. The other judges jumped up, shocked and elated. Terry Crews ran onto the stage, arms wide, shouting with joy. But Simon didn't smile. He didn't stand. He didn't celebrate. He just sat there, staring at Robert, his hands still on the buzzer, his eyes saying everything words couldn't. Robert looked around, bewildered, as golden confetti rained down on him. He didn't understand what had just happened. He looked at Simon, confused, seeking an explanation. Simon picked up his microphone. His voice was steady now, but softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Robert," he said, "that golden buzzer isn't for you. It's for Eleanor. Because she raised a man who knows what love really means. And that deserves to go straight to the live shows." The audience lost it. People were sobbing, screaming, hugging. Even the crew backstage, hardened professionals who'd seen hundreds of performances, were wiping their eyes. Heidi ran onto the stage and hugged Robert. Sophia followed. Howie joined them. Terry wrapped his massive arms around all of them. And in the middle of it all, Robert stood holding that photograph, tears streaming down his face, whispering, "I did it, Eleanor. I kept my promise." Simon remained at the judge's table. Alone. Watching. And for just a moment, the camera caught something rare. A single tear rolling down Simon Cowell's face. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. Because some moments are too sacred to hide. Share this video if you believe love never dies. Subscribe if you want to see more stories that prove humanity still exists. Because what you just witnessed wasn't just television. It was truth. The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within hours it had gone viral. #Robert and Eleanor trended worldwide. News outlets picked up the story. Talk shows invited Robert as a guest. Celebrities shared the clip. Millions of people who never watched America's Got Talent in their lives watched this moment and cried. But the real impact wasn't measured in views or shares. It was measured in the thousands of messages Robert received from widows and widowers around the world. People who'd lost their partners and didn't know how to move forward. People who felt invisible in their grief. People who needed to see that their love still mattered. Robert read every single message. And in interviews afterward, he always said the same thing. "Eleanor wanted me to be brave. And Simon gave me the courage to do it." As for Simon, he rarely spoke about that night. When reporters asked him about it, he deflected. "It wasn't about me," he'd say. "It was about a man honoring his wife. That's all." But those who worked with him noticed something. He was different after that night. A little softer. A little more patient. A little quicker to see the humanity in the people who stood before him. Because sometimes, all it takes is one honest moment to remind us why we do what we do. One real story in a sea of performances. One man keeping a promise to the woman he loved. And Simon Cowell, the man who'd seen everything, had been changed by it. Robert never won America's Got Talent. He was eliminated in the semi-finals. But he didn't care. He'd already won something more valuable. He'd kept his word. And Eleanor, wherever she was, had heard him sing. That photograph of Eleanor still sits on Robert's mantle. Next to it now is a framed golden buzzer, signed by Simon Cowell with a simple message. "Promises kept are love made visible." Some promises outlive death. Robert proved it. Simon witnessed it. And the world will never forget it.